Winslow Turner had already lost everything that once made his life whole. 1 month earlier, he had buried the 3 people who mattered most to him: his wife, his son, and his little daughter. The fire that consumed their home had taken them quickly, too quickly. It left behind nothing but ashes, silence, and questions that refused to leave him alone. And yet, the cruelest thing about tragedy is that it rarely arrives alone. Sometimes it opens the door for something far older, something that has been waiting. Now Winslow stood alone inside the decaying halls of the Turner estate, a place he had been warned about 30 years ago by a man who should never have been able to send him a letter. The hallway stretched before him like a long-forgotten corridor of time. The walls were cracked and stained with the marks of smoke that had settled there decades ago. Pieces of plaster had fallen away, exposing the old wooden beams beneath. The air carried a dry, dusty smell mixed with the faint bitterness of burnt timber. And at the far end of that hallway, a door had opened, slowly, quietly, as though someone on the other side had been waiting for the exact moment Winslow stepped into the house. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly as he raised it toward the doorway. Moments ago, he had heard a voice, soft, low, almost gentle, but unmistakably real. "You came back." Those words still lingered in the darkness around him. Winslow swallowed slowly, his throat dry as he listened. The house had fallen silent again, not the comfortable silence of an empty building, but the kind that feels as though something is holding its breath, waiting to see what you will do next. He took one cautious step forward. The old floorboards creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoing down the corridor. The open doorway stood ahead of him like a mouth waiting to speak. He had no memory of this house, no memory of ever walking these halls as a child, no memory of the fire that had destroyed half the estate all those years ago. And yet something deep in his chest felt disturbingly familiar, not comforting, not welcoming, just familiar, the kind of feeling you get when you return to a place your mind tried very hard to forget. Winslow lifted the letter from his coat pocket without looking at it. He had read it so many times over the past month that he knew every word by heart. His father's handwriting had warned him about this place, warned him to stay away, warned him never to return. But the letter had arrived too late, because whatever truth waited inside the Turner estate, it had already begun reaching for him long before he stepped through the gate tonight. Winslow slowly exhaled. Then he started walking toward the open door. Each step felt heavier than the last. The beam of his flashlight slid across the peeling wallpaper and broken frames hanging crooked on the walls. Dust drifted through the light like tiny floating ghosts. Somewhere deeper inside the house, something shifted, a faint sound, not quite a footstep, but close enough to make the hairs along the back of his neck stand on end. Winslow stopped walking. He listened. Nothing. Only the quiet creaking of old wood settling in the cold night air. He forced himself to move again. Closer now, just a few feet from the doorway. The darkness inside the room seemed thicker somehow, as though the light from his flashlight struggled to push its way inside. And as Winslow raised the beam toward the threshold, something inside the room moved. Not quickly, not violently, just a slow, subtle motion, like someone stepping out of sight the moment they realized they had been seen. Winslow froze. His heart thudded once in his chest. Then again, the open doorway waited. The darkness beyond it watched. And somewhere within the walls of the Turner estate, Something seemed quietly pleased that he had finally come home. Winslow did not move for several seconds. The open doorway remained still, dark and silent. Nothing stepped out. Nothing revealed itself. Yet the feeling that something had just been there refused to leave him. He tightened his grip around the flashlight. Slowly, cautiously, he took another step forward. The old hallway floor groaned under his weight. Dust shifted along the walls. Somewhere behind him, a loose window pane rattled faintly in the wind outside, but the sound did not distract him. All of his attention remained fixed on the open doorway. Another step, then another. The closer he came, the more the air began to change. At first, it was subtle, just a slight drop in temperature, like the kind you might notice when stepping into a basement during winter. But with every step toward the room, the cold grew heavier. It pressed gently against his skin. It slid down the back of his neck. By the time he reached the threshold, his breath had begun to fog faintly in the beam of the flashlight. Winslow paused at the doorway and slowly lifted the light. The beam crossed the floor first. Blackened wood stretched across the room, scarred by old burn marks that had carved deep, jagged patterns through the boards. Some sections of the floor looked as though the fire had nearly eaten straight through them. Then the light moved upward, and what it revealed made Winslow's brow slowly crease with confusion. The room was wrong. From the outside hallway, the walls of the estate suggested a narrow space, perhaps a small bedroom or storage area. But the room in front of him stretched much deeper than that, far deeper. The back wall sat several yards farther away than it should have been. Winslow frowned slightly. He glanced back toward the hallway behind him, then forward again into the room. The structure of the house should not allow this space to exist. Yet there it was, a room that seemed larger than the walls surrounding it. The flashlight flickered suddenly. The beam dimmed for half a second before returning to full brightness. Winslow tapped the side of the flashlight gently. It steadied again. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The cold intensified immediately. It wrapped around him in a way that felt almost unnatural, as though the temperature inside this single room had been drained away from the rest of the house. The silence inside the room felt different too. He could no longer hear the distant wind outside. No creaking wood, no rattling windows. Just stillness, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. Winslow slowly swept the beam of the flashlight along the walls. At first, he thought he was looking at peeling wallpaper. But then the shapes became clearer. Lines, crayon marks, dozens of them. The walls were covered in drawings, children's drawings. Winslow took a few slow steps deeper into the room, raising the flashlight closer to the nearest wall. Paper sheets had been taped or nailed across the plaster in uneven rows. Some were yellowed with age. Others were torn along the edges. All of them were covered in rough, childish sketches. The first drawing showed the outline of a large house. Even in the crude style of a child's hand, the shape was unmistakable. The Turner estate. Another drawing showed the same house again. But this time, thick orange and red scribbles climbed across the roof. Flames. Winslow felt a strange tightness settle in his chest. He moved the flashlight further along the wall. More drawings appeared. Stick figures standing beside the house, some tall, some small children. Their arms were drawn as thin lines stretching outward to one another, and in several of the drawings, a dark shape stood behind them. It was larger than the others. Its body was nothing more than a tall shadow drawn with heavy black strokes. No face, no feature, just a towering shape that loomed behind the children. In picture after picture, Winslow's eyes slowly followed the row of drawings along the wall. Every scene repeated the same pattern: the house, the children, the shadow, and always flames somewhere nearby. His flashlight drifted toward the center of the room. That was when he noticed the chair. A small wooden chair sat alone in the middle of the blackened floor. Its surface was worn smooth with age. One of the legs had been crudely repaired with a strip of metal nailed into place. It looked like the kind of chair a child might sit in while drawing at a table. But there was no table, just the chair, waiting. Winslow stepped closer. The beam of his flashlight lowered slightly toward the seat. More faint crayon marks covered the wood. Random scribbles, circles, lines, as though someone had once sat here, drawing for hours at a time while staring at the walls. A faint chill crept further into Winslow's bones. Something about this room felt disturbingly familiar. Not in the way a place feels when you recognize it, but in the way a forgotten memory sometimes stirs quietly beneath the surface of your mind. Like a dream you almost remember. Winslow slowly turned the flashlight back toward the walls. There were so many drawings, dozens, perhaps hundreds, and every single one had been made by a child's hand. Somewhere in the quiet of the room, a faint sound appeared, so soft that at first Winslow thought it might only be the blood moving through his ears. But then it came again, a slow, uneven scratch, like the sound of crayon pressing against paper. Winslow froze. The room had been empty when he entered. Yet the sound continued very slowly, very softly, from somewhere behind him. Winslow did not turn around immediately. The faint scratching sound behind him continued for only a few seconds before fading back into silence. By the time he slowly looked over his shoulder, the room was still exactly as he had found it. Empty. The small wooden chair sat quietly in the center of the floor. The walls remained covered in drawings. Nothing had moved. And yet the feeling that he was no longer alone refused to disappear. Winslow forced himself to breathe slowly and turned his attention back to the drawings. If something had happened in this house all those years ago, the walls of this room seemed determined to remember it. He stepped closer to the nearest row of papers. The flashlight beam slid across another set of childish sketches. At first glance, they looked no different from the others. Rough crayon strokes, uneven lines, bright colors faded by time. But the longer he studied them, the more a pattern began to form. Many of the drawings showed the same group of children, 5 of them usually, sometimes standing in front of the estate, sometimes inside a room that looked disturbingly similar to the one Winslow now stood in. And almost every time, one particular child appeared among them, a boy drawn with slightly darker lines than the rest. In some drawings he stood near the other children. In others he stood a little farther away, as though watching them. Winslow leaned closer. Beneath the figure of the boy, written in uneven crayon letters, was a name, Winslow. He stared at it for several seconds. His mind rejected the idea immediately. Children often wrote random names in their drawings. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean the drawings had anything to do with him. But then he moved the flashlight to the next sheet. The same boy appeared again, and again, and again. In drawing after drawing, the same child stood among the others, and beneath every one of those drawings, the same name had been written: Winslow. Winslow Turner felt the muscles in his chest tighten slightly. A faint pressure began building behind his ribs, the uncomfortable kind that arrives when your body recognizes something before your mind is ready to accept it. He slowly continued moving along the wall. More drawings, more children, more flames surrounding the house. And always that same tall black shape lurking somewhere behind them, watching. The flashlight beam eventually drifted toward a narrow section of wall where the drawings had been pushed slightly apart. Something else had been pinned there. Not paper, something thicker. Winslow stepped closer and raised the light. A yellowed newspaper clipping had been carefully nailed to the wall between two drawings. The edges of the article had curled with age, and faint burn marks darkened one corner. Winslow leaned in and began to read. The headline stretched across the top of the page in bold black letters: Tragedy at Turner Estate. Children lost in mysterious fire. The words seemed to press into his mind with a strange weight. His eyes moved slowly down the column of faded text. The article described a devastating fire that had torn through the Turner estate decades earlier. Authorities had arrived too late. By the time the flames were extinguished, several parts of the mansion had been reduced to charred ruins. But it was not the destruction of the building that had shocked the town. It was what had been discovered inside. Several children had been staying at the estate that night. Some visiting, some living there. The fire had taken them. Winslow felt the pressure in his chest grow stronger as he read. Then his eyes moved to the date printed near the top of the article. 289. His hand slowly lowered from the wall. For a brief moment, he simply stared at the numbers, because in 1989, Winslow Turner had been 7 years old. A quiet wave of unease passed through him. Not fear, not yet, just the creeping sensation that pieces of a story were beginning to arrange themselves around him in ways he did not understand. He lifted the flashlight again and continued reading. Near the bottom of the article, a list of names had been printed. The names of the children who had been present the night of the fire. But someone had marked the article afterward. A thick circle drawn in dark ink surrounded the list, as though someone wanted those names to stand out. Winslow moved the flashlight closer. One by one he read them. 5 names, children who had supposedly died in the fire. Then his eyes stopped moving. The final name on the list sat near the bottom of the circle. 2 simple words printed clearly in black ink. Winslow Turner. The room seemed to grow colder. Winslow stared at the name for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. Because, according to the article, Winslow Turner had been inside the Turner estate the night it burned. And, according to the list of victims printed in the paper, he had never made it out. Winslow continued, staring at the name printed on the yellowed newspaper. For several seconds, he did not move. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly as the beam rested on the article, illuminating the circle someone had drawn around the list of children. 5 names, 5 lives, tied to the tragedy that had taken place inside this very estate. 4 of them had small marks beside them, tiny crosses drawn with dark ink, but the 5th name, his name had been underlined. Winslow's brow tightened as he leaned closer, forcing himself to read the final lines of the article that followed beneath the list. The print was faint, but still legible. The report explained that investigators had initially believed every child inside the estate had died in the fire. But during the early hours of the following morning, rescue workers discovered something unexpected. 1 child had survived. The boy had been found unconscious near the rear entrance of the mansion. He had suffered smoke inhalation and severe shock, but had somehow escaped the flames. Authorities had removed him from the property immediately and placed him under medical care. The article ended with a final sentence that seemed to echo loudly in the quiet room. The only known survivor of the Turner estate fire was a 7-year-old boy named Winslow Turner. Winslow slowly lowered the flashlight. His mind felt strangely distant, as though the room had drifted several feet farther away from him. 7 years old, that was the age printed in the article, the same age he had been when the fire happened. The same age that had appeared beneath the photograph he had found earlier in the house. A photograph labeled Winslow Turner, age 7. His breathing became slightly uneven because there was one problem with all of this. He had no memory of it. No memory of living inside the Turner estate. No memory of other children. No memory of fire. His childhood memories began years later, in another town, in another home, with distant relatives who had raised him without ever speaking about where he came from. Winslow stumbled backward a step. The floor creaked sharply beneath his shoe. He raised the flashlight again and turned slowly, shining the beam across the walls. The drawing stared back at him. The mansion, the flames, the children, and that tall, dark shape looming behind them. Every piece of it now felt heavier, more personal, because if the article was telling the truth, then Winslow Turner had once lived in this house. He had once stood inside this very room as a child, and somehow he had been the only one who made it out alive. A sudden chill ran along his spine. The drawings, the photograph, the newspaper clipping, none of these things should have been here waiting for him unless someone had placed them here, waiting for the day he returned. Winslow took another slow step backward. The beam of his flashlight drifted toward the doorway behind him. The hallway outside remained dark and empty. But the silence had changed again. Something had shifted inside the house. He could feel it. Then a sound broke the stillness. A single footstep. Not distant, not somewhere across the estate. Directly behind him, Winslow froze. His heart struck hard against his ribs. The flashlight beam trembled as he slowly turned his head over his shoulder. Another step followed, closer this time. The sound of weight pressing carefully against old wooden floorboards. Samayan was walking inside the room with him. Winslow's breath caught in his throat because he had entered the room alone, and the footsteps were now only a few feet away. Winslow did not turn immediately. The footsteps behind him had stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. For a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. The human mind had a way of creating sounds when fear pushed itself too far into your thoughts. But the feeling in the room told him otherwise. Something had moved. Something had walked across the floor only moments ago, and now it was standing somewhere in the darkness behind him. Winslow slowly exhaled. His fingers tightened around the flashlight as he forced himself to turn. The beam of light swept across the room. The small wooden chair still sat in the center of the floor. The walls remained covered with the same dozens of drawings. Nothing stood behind him. No person, no shadow, no movement. The room appeared empty. Yet Winslow could not shake the certainty that someone had just been standing there only seconds ago. He slowly backed toward the doorway, his eyes moving carefully across the walls as he kept the flashlight raised. And that was when he noticed it. Something had changed. At first, the difference seemed small, just another sheet of paper pinned among the others. But Winslow knew with quiet certainty that it had not been there before, because he had already scanned that entire section of the wall. The paper looked newer than the others. The edges had not curled with age. The crayon lines were darker, fresher. Winslow stepped closer. The flashlight beam steadied as it illuminated the drawing. It showed a hallway, long and narrow, the same cracked walls, the same broken frames hanging at crooked angles, the same doorway at the far end. Winslow felt his stomach tighten, because it was the hallway he had just walked through. In the center of the drawing stood a figure holding a flashlight. The crude lines of the crayon still managed to capture the shape clearly. A man standing exactly where Winslow had been standing only moments earlier. The man in the drawing wore a long coat. His arm was raised slightly as he pointed a flashlight down the hall. Winslow's breathing slowed because, despite the childish style of the picture, the figure looked unmistakably like him. The same posture, the same stance, the same light in his hand. Winslow stared at the drawing for several long seconds. Then the flashlight drifted slightly higher on the page, and his chest tightened, because the drawing did not end with the man behind the figure. Something else had been drawn, a tall shape, much larger than the man, its long arms stretched downward like heavy shadows. Its body towered above the figure in the hallway. The child who had drawn it had filled the shape with thick black crayon strokes until it looked almost solid against the paper. And in the drawing, that dark figure stood only inches behind the man, watching him, waiting. Winslow's heartbeat began to pound slowly in his ears, because the man in the drawing had not yet turned around. He did not know what stood behind him. Winslow slowly lowered the flashlight. Then, almost without thinking, he raised it toward the real hallway behind him. The beam of light slid through the open doorway. The corridor stretched away into darkness. Empty, silent, no movement, no figure standing there. But before Winslow could take another step, a sound slipped through the quiet air of the house. Soft close, a child's voice. It did not echo through the hall. It did not come from outside the room. It sounded as though it had been whispered directly beside his ear. 3 quiet words, low, cold, and filled with something that felt far older than the voice itself. You weren't supposed to survive. My Dossi. Winslow's entire body went still. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as he slowly turned his head toward the darkness behind him. But the room remained empty. The drawings stared silently from the walls. The small wooden chair sat motionless at the center of the floor. Yet, somewhere inside the Turner estate, something had just spoken, and it knew exactly who Winslow Turner was. If you discovered your name on a list of people who supposedly died decades ago, what would you do next? Would you leave the house immediately or stay and uncover the truth? Let me know your answer in the comments. And if you want to follow Winslow's journey, deeper into the mystery of the Turner estate, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Voices After Dark so you don't miss the next chapter.